So thank you for clicking on this page and joining my presentations. So my name is Guangyu Zhu. I'm currently a PhD candidate here in Australian National University. So this is a talk present at the Virtual MathPsych conference, and thereby give the Society of Mathematical Psychologists a non-exclusive, non-transferable, and non-revocable license to make these contents publicly available. So this presentation is about the challenge and approach that researchers may face and use when studying mediation relationships. So the commonly used mediation approach in psychology are regression-based approach, such as the Borel and Koenig criteria, Sobel test, and structural equilibrium models. So this approach have two important assumptions behind them. First, it requires that there is evidence or theoretical argument supporting the causalities or temporal precedence between the variables paired to these mediation models. So in other words, it requires that the independent variables would have a causal effect on the mediator, and the mediator would have a causal effect on this outcome variable. And second, this assumptions require that the estimations of this effect was under the eliminations of confounders. So in other words, there are no other variables affecting any two of these three variables in these studies. However, the evidence supporting the two assumptions can be difficult to find, and sometimes, even though we might take efforts to search for this evidence, it's still hard to find them. So this leads to a dilemma in the practice of this mediation approach. According to a systematic reviews on the qualitative of these mediation studies in psychology, we found that only 24% of these studies mention the evidence for causalities between variables, and only 60% of these studies mention the controls for potential confounders. So this unsatisfactory practice of this mediation approach has been criticized, and without this evidence supporting these assumptions, the validity of our regression-based approach in assessing mediation relationships is largely impacted. And under these situations, they could only test the covariations between variables. Thus, the aim of these presentations is to identify the several challenges that may prevent the researchers from the evidence supporting these assumptions and provide some advanced approach to address this challenge. So the first challenge researchers may face when using the psychological states as mediators are the latent variable states of these psychological states. So most psychological states are unobservable latent variables, and they are usually assumed to be interval or continuous variables and cannot be categorized as either presence or absence. So this brings us the challenge of designing a randomized experiment to assess its causalities between other outcome variables. And meanwhile, the relationships between the psychological states and the indicators is usually assumed to be probabilistic, and the indicators may also be related to other variables as well. And thus it is hard to directly manipulate these psychological states without influencing other variables. And second, some psychological processes are nearly instantaneously. So a common method to assess the temporal precedence between variables is to measure the variables sequentially and observe this sequential change. But this sequential measurement could provide evidence supporting the temporal precedence if the sequential change in the variables is slower than the time taken to measure these variables. However, some cognitive process can occur in 100 milliseconds, and measuring times may take several minutes, and this brings us the challenge of assessing the temporal precedence between variables, and this can even lead to false identifications of mediation relationships. So for example, variables may change simultaneously, but the sequential measurement could still identify a temporal precedence among them, and this could lead to a false concurrence of these mediation relationships. And in addition to this, there might also be some potential confounders. They are unknown in our psychological research, so we don't know how to control them. And also, the similarities in the measures could also compose another source of confounders, which is the common method bias. So according to studies, about 32 of these standard variance in the data could be attributed to similarities in the measures, And this common method bias could lead to false correlations and thus false identifications of mediation relationships. Given this presence of these confounders, researchers may want to control all these confounders and covariants, but this might lead to the fifth challenge, the bad control problems. So the bad control problems refers to the situation where controlling for these confounders or covariants is not always beneficial, might be even detrimental in a mediation study. So for example, when the confounders is affected by both the cause and effect, conditioning of such a confounders will lead to a causalar bias or endogenous selection bias. So I won't explain it too much here, but if you are interested, you can find these seed papers to look at. And lastly, the causal heterogeneities may also interfere with our mediation conclusions. So individuals' response to a change in these mean-dependent variables and mediators may vary depending on their traits, and this could threaten the validity of a mediation conclusion. The causal heterogeneities was embodied in an individual's cognitive process, and such heterogeneities was stable across time. Thus, our research should definitely address this point. However, our previous approach, especially the regression-based approach, only focuses on the average level of these mediation relationships, ignoring these causal heterogeneities. So to address this challenge, here we introduced some approach from other disciplines. So first, to address the challenge in assessing the causalities, especially the causalities between the mediators and the outcome variables, here we can use this encouragement design. So the encouragement is an intervention that could indirectly influence the values of these mediators. So when you use these designs, we need to assume that this encouragement has no direct effect on these outcome variables, and its effect is only via this mediator. So in this encouragement, we have two conditions. In the encouragement conditions, there is an intervention on this mediator, and thus we expect that there should be a change in the mediator. And in the no encouragement conditions, there should be no change in the mediators, given that there is no interventions. And thus, by assuming the causalities between the mediators and outcome variables, we should expect that there is a change in these outcome variables under encouragement conditions, and there is no change in the outcomes under no encouragement conditions. And this could lead to a significant difference between the two conditions, which could give us a chance to test if the mediator had an effect on these outcome variables. And meanwhile, if there was no causalities between the mediators and the outcome variables, then we would expect there is no change in these outcome variables, even though we can find a change in this mediator. And thus, these designs can also help falsify the causalities between these mediators and outcome variables. And the second design to emphasize these causalities between variables is block design. So this block design is based on these counterfactual definitions of causal dependence. So applying these definitions to mediation relationships, this means that if there is a change in the mediator, then there should be a change in the outcome variables. And if this change in the mediator disappeared, then the change in these outcome variables should disappear. And thus, the blocker designs assigns the causalities between the three variables by blocking the pathways from the independent variables to this mediator. And thus, when there is a blockage, then there should be no difference in these mediators between control and treatment conditions. And therefore, there will be no or less difference in the dependent variables, depending on whether there is a partial or full mediation relationships. And to address the potential confounders, researchers can also use an instrumental variables approach to provide accurate estimations of the causal effect by finding instrumental variables satisfy these three conditions. So this instrumental variables is similar to encouragement in the previous slides. They had a causal effect on M and only affect the outcome variables through the mediators, and thus this enables us to test these mediation relationships using these instrumental variables. And in addition, we can also use this sensitivity test to help us estimate the probabilisticness of our mediation relationships on the different levels just of confounders. And we can also use the difference measurement to avoid this common method bias. Regarding the bad control problems, we can use the directed aleckic graphs and backdoor criteria to guide our decisions on which variables to control for. And for this causal heterogeneities, we can use mediation. We can sequentially assign people to both control and treatment conditions, assuming no carry-out effect to test these causal heterogeneities in these mediation relationships. And if there were between subject designs, we can first match participants from different conditions and analyze the stress of mediation relationships among different subgroups. And finally, we want to say that the debates around the mediation relationships in psychology has resulted on two controls views. So one view said the mediation relationships exist as long as there is a significant direct effect from this regression-based approach, while the others argue that only a mediation study that satisfies all the assumptions can yield meaningful mediation relationships. Well, we would argue that the two views are somehow biased, as the former overlooks the importance of temporal velocities and the eliminations of alternative explanations in assessing the causal relationships, while the latter can be over-optimistic about the likelihood of satisfying the assumptions for this different approach. And thus, we would argue that researchers should not expect a single study satisfying all these assumptions to provide a perfect evidence for mediation relationships. And it just adds Berkeley that in practice, it is often impossible to draw conclusions about mediations without involving strong and untestable assumptions. And sometimes, even when these assumptions are invoked, the data requirement for persuasive mediation analysis typically neutrals drawing numerical studies. And thus, we would argue that we shouldn't expect one single answer here. And researchers could also use the three layers of causal hierarchies from Peirce-Brooks causalities to get their explorations of mediation relationships evidence. So the results from different designs of approach could be categorized into different levels of causal hierarchy. And thus we argue that the assessment of these mediation relationships should be viewed as a process of evidence accumulations, and researchers should go beyond this regression-based approach and try different designs to dig out the different levels of evidence supporting mediation relationships. So thanks for your listening to my presentations. So that's all the things for my presentations. If you are interested in my research, please feel free to email me. And I'm also looking for a postdoc position. So if you are interested in, if you have any available positions, please also email me. Thank you.